There's a hole in the ground in Washington state. Nobody knows how deep it goes. A man named Mel Waters dropped a fishing line into it for days. It never touched the bottom. Then a camera went in. What came back on that footage changed the way a small group of scientists looked at the earth beneath our feet. And then the government showed up, and Mel Waters vanished. There's a place in Kittitas County, Washington state, that does not appear on any official geological survey. It sits on a quiet stretch of rural land, surrounded by pine trees and dry grass. From a distance, it looks like nothing. Just a dark circle in the ground, roughly 9 feet wide. No fence around it. No warning signs. No explanation. The locals knew about it for years. They called it Mel's Hole, not because of what it was, but because of who owned the land it sat on. Mel Waters was not a scientist. He was not a government official. He was an ordinary man living on a piece of land in rural Washington. He had sheep. He had a quiet life. And in his backyard, he had a hole. For years, Mel used it the way many rural landowners use natural pits. He threw garbage in. Old appliances, broken tools, things he did not need anymore. This is not unusual in remote areas. Land is wide. Disposal is simple. You find a hole, you use it. But Mel began to notice something. The hole never filled up. He kept throwing things in. Season after season, year after year. The level never rose. The garbage never accumulated at a visible depth. It was as if the hole simply swallowed everything and asked for more. Most people would have stopped thinking about it. Mel did the opposite. He got curious. In the mid-1990s, Mel decided to measure the hole. He purchased standard fishing line and attached a weight to the end. He dropped it in. He let it unspool. He waited. The line kept going. He attached more line. Still no bottom. He continued this process over several sessions, using thousands of feet of fishing line connected end to end. After enough line to measure nearly 80,000 feet had descended into the hole, Mel stopped. Not because the line hit bottom, but because he ran out of line. 80,000 feet is roughly 15 miles. No natural geological formation in that region should produce a vertical shaft of that depth. The geology of Kittitas County does not support it. The rock composition does not allow for it. And yet, the line kept going. Geologists who later heard this account were skeptical. That is a reasonable response. 15 miles of vertical depth beneath a rural farm is not something that should exist. But skepticism did not answer the question. It simply made the question louder. There was something else Mel noticed during his measurements. Animals would not go near the hole. His dogs, which roamed the property freely, refused to approach it. They would stop at a certain distance and turn back. No barking. No growling, just a quiet, firm refusal to get any closer. That detail seems small, but investigators would return to it later, because what the animals sensed, the camera would eventually confirm. In January of 1997, Mel Waters made a phone call to a late-night radio program called Coast to Coast AM. At the time, the show was hosted by Art Bell, one of the most widely listened to overnight radio broadcasters in America. The show covered fringe topics, paranormal events, unexplained phenomena. It had a large and dedicated audience. But even by the standards of that program, what Mel Waters said that night was different. He was calm. That is the first thing people noticed when they went back and listened to the recordings. He did not sound like someone trying to sell a story. He did not use dramatic language. He spoke the way a man speaks when he is describing something he has seen with his own eyes and has not yet found the words to fully explain. He described the hole, the dimensions, the fact that it never filled, the fishing line measurements. He described his dogs refusing to approach. He spoke carefully and slowly, as if he was aware that what he was saying sounded impossible and wanted to be precise anyway. The response was immediate. Thousands of listeners contacted the station. Researchers began making inquiries. Amateur investigators started looking for the location. But it was not the public response that became significant. It was what happened behind closed doors, in offices that do not typically respond to late-night radio programs. Because someone was listening who was not a casual fan of strange stories. Mel returned to Coast AM for a second interview. And in that second appearance, the story shifted into territory that moved beyond geology. He described an incident involving a dead dog. A neighbor's dog had died. The body was brought to the hole and dropped in, as was common practice for animal disposal in rural areas at the time. What Mel claimed happened next is the detail that researchers have argued about ever since. He said the dog came back out, not in a dramatic way, not all at once, but Mel described seeing the animal emerge from the hole sometime later, alive, behaving differently than it had in life, but physically present and moving. This is the point where many listeners stop believing him. But this is also the point where the story becomes harder to dismiss, because Mel Waters was not the only person to describe something coming back out of that hole. And the accounts that followed his did not come from radio listeners looking for attention. They came from people who had never heard of Mel Waters at all. There was also a secondary claim from the second interview that received less attention at the time, but would later prove more significant. Mel mentioned that he had attempted to lower a light source into the hole. A simple flashlight attached to a line. He lowered it slowly. At a certain depth, the light changed. Not dimmed, not flickered, changed. As if the light itself was behaving according to different rules the further it descended. He did not have an explanation for this. Neither did the people who came after him with better equipment. Because when the camera finally went into the hole, the light did the same thing. And that was the least disturbing part of what the footage showed. If you value deep investigations like this, consider subscribing. There is much more ahead. It did not happen immediately. There was a period of months between Mel Waters going public and the first serious attempt to document the hole with recording equipment. During that time, the location attracted a quiet stream of visitors. Most were curious. Some were researchers in the loosest sense of the word. A few had genuine scientific backgrounds, but no institutional support, which meant no official records of their visits exist. The first camera attempt was low-tech by modern standards. A small mounted camera, the kind used for pipeline inspections, was attached to a reinforced cable. The camera had a light source built into its housing. It had a temperature sensor. It had a basic audio recording function. The team that lowered it was small. 3 people. 2 of them had engineering backgrounds. One was documenting the process on a separate handheld camera positioned above the hole. They began lowering the camera at approximately 9 in the morning. The first 50 feet produced nothing unusual. The walls of the hole were visible on the feed. Dark soil, compressed rock. The texture of the walls was consistent with a naturally formed vertical shaft, though the regularity of the shape was noted as slightly unusual. Natural formations tend to be irregular. This hole was almost geometrically consistent in its width. That detail was logged, but not immediately flagged as significant. Below 100 feet, the temperature sensor recorded a drop. This was unexpected. In standard geological terms, temperature increases as you descend into the earth. The deeper you go, the warmer it gets. This is a basic principle of geothermal science. It has been consistently measured and documented across thousands of drill sites worldwide. But at roughly 115 feet, the sensor in the camera housing recorded a decrease in temperature of 11 degrees. The team noted it, kept lowering. At 200 feet, the camera light began to behave in the way Mel Waters had described with his flashlight. The beam, which had been projecting normally, began to compress. Not fade, not weaken, compress, as if the light was being pulled inward rather than allowed to spread outward. The footage from this point shows a narrowing cone of illumination that does not match any standard explanation for light behavior in an enclosed vertical shaft. The engineer on the team later described it this way. He said it looked like the light was afraid to touch the walls. That description is not scientific, but it is the one that stayed with people who watched the footage. Below 250 feet, the audio function on the camera began picking up something. At first, it registered as interference, a low-frequency hum that sat below the range of normal human hearing but was detectable on the recording equipment. The team above the hole did not hear it with their ears. They saw it on the monitor as a wave pattern running beneath the visual feed. The hum was consistent, rhythmic, not random static, not mechanical interference from the cable. Something below was producing a sound that followed a pattern. At 310 feet, the camera stopped transmitting. Not because the cable ran out. Not because the equipment failed in any recognizable way. The feed simply ended. One frame showed the compressed light and the dark walls. The next frame was black. And then the cable, when pulled back up, showed the camera housing intact. No damage. No water. No debris. But the temperature sensor on the housing read 41 degrees colder than when it went in. And the audio recording, when analyzed later, contained something in those final seconds of feed that the team had not heard on the monitor in real time. A sound, distinct, structured, at a frequency that one audio engineer later said did not match any known natural or mechanical source he had encountered in 30 years of work. The team packed up that evening and drove back to their respective homes. Two of them never returned to the site. The third one did. And what he brought with him the second time would produce footage that nobody who has seen it has been able to explain away. The third member of the original team was a man who has never been fully identified in any public record. Researchers who have investigated this case refer to him only by a partial name. Some call him R, harmful. Others use only an initial. What is known about him comes from secondhand accounts and a single document that surfaced in 2002 on a now-defunct research forum. That document described his background as applied physics with fieldwork in subsurface geological measurement. Whether that is accurate or not, what he brought to the hole on his second visit was significantly more sophisticated than what the team had used the first time. He came with a thermal imaging attachment, a secondary audio sensor calibrated to detect infrasound, which is sound that exists below 20 hertz and cannot be detected by the human ear, but has measurable physical effects on the human body. He also brought a radiation dosimeter, a device that measures exposure to ionizing radiation. And he brought a second camera, smaller, mounted independently of the main cable rig, so that if one feed cut out, the other might continue recording. He lowered both cameras simultaneously. The results from the thermal imaging attachment were the first sign that something below the surface was not behaving according to any known physical model. Thermal imaging measures heat signatures. In a standard underground environment, the thermal profile is relatively stable. Rock does not produce dramatic heat variation in a confined vertical shaft. But as the cameras descended past the 100-foot mark, the thermal feed began showing something that the researcher described in his document as inverse thermal blooming. In simple terms, the heat was moving the wrong way. In any normal environment, heat rises. Warm air moves upward. Cold air settles below. This is basic thermodynamics. It is not a theory. It is an observed and consistently measured physical law. But the thermal data from below 100 feet showed heat signatures moving downward. Concentrated pockets of warmth descending rather than rising, as if something below was pulling heat toward it rather than releasing it upward. The infrasound sensor confirmed what the first team's audio recording had suggested. The low-frequency hum was real. It was not interference. It was not a product of the equipment. The sensor isolated it at approximately 18.5 hertz. That specific frequency has been studied in other contexts. Infrasound at that range has been associated with feelings of unease in human subjects. Some researchers have connected it to reported experiences of dread in certain locations. It has been detected near fault lines, near large bodies of moving water, near certain industrial sites. It had not previously been recorded emanating from a static underground shaft with no known mechanical source. Below 200 feet on this second descent, the radiation dosimeter registered an increase. It was not a dramatic spike. It was a slow, steady climb that began around 180 feet and continued as the cameras descended further. The type of radiation the dosimeter detected was not consistent with radon, which is the most common naturally occurring radioactive gas found in underground environments. It was a different signature, one that the researcher noted in his document as requiring further analysis from a facility with more specialized equipment. That further analysis, if it ever happened, has never been made public. At 270 feet, the secondary camera captured something on its feed that the main camera, positioned slightly differently on the cable, did not capture. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. The footage shows a change in the visual field below the camera. Not an object, Not a figure. A change. The darkness below the camera's light shifted in a way that suggested either movement or a change in the reflective properties of whatever surface or space existed below. For seconds, then it was gone. The researcher's document described his response to seeing that footage with a single sentence. He wrote that he immediately began pulling the cameras back up without finishing the descent. He did not explain why in clinical terms. He used a word that is not typical in a scientific document. He wrote that something below felt aware. That word, aware, it sat in the document without further elaboration. And it was not the last time someone who went near that hole used it. Because when the government arrived shortly after, the word that kept appearing in the limited documentation that has since leaked was not geological. It was not environmental. The word that appeared most often in the margin notes of those early federal assessments was the same one the researcher had used. Aware. If you value deep investigations like this, consider subscribing. What comes next changes everything. It did not happen with sirens. It did not happen with black vehicles and men in suits, the way these stories are sometimes told. It happened quietly, the way most things that are meant to go unnoticed happen. A letter arrived at the Kittitas County Land Registry office. Then a second letter. Then a series of communications between a federal land management agency and the local county office that, on the surface, appeared entirely routine. The language in those communications was administrative, dry, the kind of language designed to move through bureaucratic channels without attracting attention. References to land assessment, environmental evaluation, subsurface rights review, none of it unusual on its own. All of it, when placed together in sequence, pointed toward one specific parcel of land, Mel Waters' property. The timeline matters here. Mel's second coast-to-coast AM interview aired in 1997. The camera descents happened in the months that followed, and the federal communications regarding his land began, according to documents obtained through public records requests by independent researchers, in early 1998. The gap between the radio broadcast and the government's administrative move was less than 14 months. For federal land processes, that is fast. Mel Waters did not fight the process publicly. What is known is that at some point in 1998, he was no longer on that land. Accounts differ on the exact mechanism. Some suggest a buyout. Some suggest a forced easement under eminent domain provisions that allow federal agencies to acquire private land for undisclosed purposes under specific national interest clauses. The paperwork, to the extent that it exists in accessible form, is heavily redacted. What is not redacted is the outcome. The land changed hands, and Mel Waters disappeared. Not in a sinister sense, at least not provably so. He did not vanish overnight. He did not leave behind concerned family members filing missing persons reports. He simply stopped being present in the public record in the way he had briefly been. No further radio appearances. No interviews. No forwarding address in any document that researchers have been able to locate. He went from being a man with a name and a property and a story to being an absence. Some investigators believe he was relocated, given a new identity in exchange for silence. This is not provable, but it is also not without precedent in cases where private citizens have stumbled on his sites of federal interest. Others believe something simpler, that Mel Waters, faced with federal pressure and public scrutiny he had not anticipated when he made that first phone call to a radio station, simply chose to disappear on his own terms. That he took whatever settlement was offered and walked away from the hole and everything associated with it. What came after his departure is more concrete. The land around the site was reclassified. The specific designation used in the reclassification is one that is typically applied to areas under environmental protection orders or subsurface mineral rights assessments. But researchers who reviewed the filing noted something unusual about the language. The standard clauses present in normal environmental reclassifications were absent. In their place were different clauses, ones more commonly associated with restricted access zones. Access to the site became complicated, not impossible, but complicated in the specific way that suggests active management rather than passive protection. Researchers who attempted to visit in the years following Mel's departure described encountering boundary markers that had not previously existed. In at least 2 documented cases, individuals who approached the area were met by personnel who identified themselves as federal land agents and were turned away without explanation. One of those individuals managed to take photographs before being redirected. Those photographs show equipment near the site, not cameras or scientific instruments of the kind that independent researchers had brought. Larger equipment, the kind used for drilling or deep subsurface access. The federal government was not just sealing the hole off. They were going back in. And whatever they found during those subsequent descents has never appeared in any document available to the public. No environmental report, no geological assessment, no incident log. The paper trail that exists before Mel's departure goes quiet in a very specific and deliberate way. Quiet in the way that only happens when someone with authority decides that certain information needs to stay below the surface. Just like everything else connected to that hole. The federal reclassification of the land did not erase the people who lived near it. Kittitas County is not a densely populated area, but is not empty either. There are ranchers whose families have worked that land for generations. There are small communities whose residents have watched the same hills and valleys change across decades. And there are people who knew about the hole long before Mel Waters ever called a radio station. These are the witnesses that no official investigation ever formally contacted. The first account comes from a rancher whose property sits approximately 2 miles from the site. His family has owned that land since the 1940s. He did not come forward publicly. His account exists because a researcher conducting door-to-door interviews in the region in 2003 knocked on his door, and he answered honestly. He described knowing about the hole as a child. His father had pointed it out to him and told him to stay away from it, not with fear in his voice, with the calm certainty of a man stating a rule that required no explanation. The rancher said his father called it the quiet place, not because it was peaceful, because sound behaved differently near it. He described standing at the edge of the property as a boy and noticing that the normal ambient noise of the countryside, bird song, wind through grass, the distant sound of machinery, seemed to stop at a certain radius around the hole, as if sound itself was reluctant to travel in that direction.